Watercolor painting is often labeled as one of the most difficult mediums out there. The added water makes the paints incredibly unpredictable at times. You have to know how to plan for a painting before even starting, and basically you need to learn a lot of things until it starts becoming easier. There are many ways to go about learning watercolor, and I'm going to give you a gentle, stress-free, and super fun solution to these problems. And it was this video that gave me the idea. I didn't come up with a concept, let's be clear about that. There are many people using this trick I'm going to show you as I speak. However, in this video, you'll learn the best way that you can use this as a watercolor beginner, and I'll do a demo to give you a framework you can use with the example of this girl drawing. You probably already know that for watercolor, you need watercolor paper. And usually that leaves us with a wide choice of blank pages we need to fill from scratch, which can be scary at first. But what if we could use any coloring book for adults and actually turn a normal piece of paper into a surface that you can paint on with watercolors, so it's much more fun and easier to learn? Think about the benefits of using watercolors on a coloring book. First, you'll get to learn from a page that's not blank, so it's not as intimidating. Then, you get to color within lines to get started, which will help you break past the fear of playing with a medium. You'll get to know it some more. And you can take advantage of a coloring book to get comfortable with color mixing and some watercolor techniques. And I'll show you exactly how I did all of that in today's artwork. But first, let's talk about the magic tools you will need, and I'm going to show you the best ones I have found and tried so far. So first, you'll need a coloring book of your choice. I prefer mine to have thick paper like this because they'll work for more mediums than just colored pencils, mediums like markers, watercolor pencils. But with this method I'm showing you today, you can try thinner papers too. Today I'll use this book by Emmanuel Collin. By the way, don't forget to give credit to the artist with coloring books if you share your art online, that's important. And before you ask, I have a link to this specific coloring book and all of the supplies I'm talking about today in the description of the video in case you want to find them for yourself. And next you'll need a primer, and that is the key to the watercolors flowing on top of the paper and other surfaces. I tried different things for my experiment. I tried white gesso for artists, super easy to find. I also purchased the Daniel Smith watercolor ground, which serves a similar purpose as gesso. They have it in several colors, so I tried the buff titanium and transparent ones. As you can see, the transparent one truly looks transparent, while the buff titanium one is very visible. So for now, I've decided that's not an option I like. And finally, the white gesso. You can also find a white watercolor ground. And that kind is my absolute favorite because, as you can see, here the line art looks toned down, and when lines are super thick and obvious in coloring books, when you don't love that, it totally helps. A quick side note here, I tried both the gesso and the watercolor ground with watercolor as part of my experiment, and I haven't really noticed a huge difference between both. I haven't looked at the specifics of each one either, but to me they look pretty similar. And of course, if some of you guys know the differences between the both of them and which would be better for that purpose of watercolor painting in a coloring book, for instance, feel free to leave a comment and let us know about it. Finally, you need something to apply the gesso or the watercolor ground. And I'll give you a shortcut here because at first I used a paintbrush like this one. It's what I've seen others using in other videos. And look at the streaks that created on the paper. That could be a good thing when you want that texture underneath, but personally, I wanted a smooth surface. I had a foam paint roller at home luckily, and it's just perfect. Look at this, it's smooth, just flawless all across, and it's quick. Yes, because if you think it's tedious to use gesso, that was my exact thought before I used it because I've heard of that technique like long ago. But it's actually not as bad as it seems. It's very easy to find and very quick to apply. The only thing is you'll have to wait for 24 hours for a first coat to dry. And if you want to apply a second coat, you'll have to wait for another 24 hours. First, you want to use something that can get a bit dirty before applying your primer. And I just pick up some of it with my brush and I go back and forth. I try and change directions to make the surface as even as possible, but really I found it's easy to do with a foam roller. I tried my watercolors on just one coat of gesso, and I also tried it on a second coat, and I didn't really see a big difference. But I'd recommend 2 coats of gesso or any primer if the sheet is really thin. Keep in mind also that with white primer, the more coats means the less visible those coloring lines will be, and it could be very useful depending on what you want to achieve. In the demo that's coming up, I'm going to show you how you can watercolor on a primed coloring book page. If you're familiar with watercolor papers, especially the very best ones, those 100% cotton watercolor papers, the ones that I've been using for the past 3 years, I can tell you painting on top of a primer is not exactly the same experience. It makes me think more of those cheaper watercolor papers that tend to dry faster. So just make sure that you're aware of that. Now, if you're just beginning, I think this is perfect to give you a push and give you that confidence to start painting. A next step for you after this, when you know you love watercolor and you're ready to invest into supplies some more, would be to transfer a design onto a better and real watercolor paper and keep learning this way. And to take it even further and just dive in, I think that taking classes is a great option. I learned on Skillshare as a beginner, and later I ended up making a bunch of classes there as well. So if that's something you'd like to try out, you'll find a link in the description that gives you a free 1 month trial to my classes as well as all others on the platform, knowing there are a bunch of super easy projects for the very beginners there. To start, I recommend a small 12 to 24 color set of watercolors, a mixing tray, and a couple of watercolor paintbrushes that will fit the size of your coloring book well enough. Paper towels and water jars are extremely helpful to clean your paintbrushes. I also like masking tape so my paper doesn't move around as I paint. And I like to use a heat gun to dry wet watercolors so I don't have to wait to apply more paint on top. I always use a white gel pen, pencil, or a white watercolor for the final highlights. You can start with zero knowledge here. The goal really is to get the ball rolling. Break past the fear, especially if you already have your supplies and you've been stuck with them for a month, which totally happened to me in the beginning. It took me a year to get started, and if you look at where I'm at today, it's well worth the effort to actually dive in. And what I find interesting, even as a more advanced artist, is that I'm going to use the concept of watercolor in coloring books to try out this new color harmony book I just bought. So even for me, it's super useful. I like to not have to go through thinking about sketching and composition and just try out stuff. It's just easier. So I'm going to mix those 3 colors from the primaries. Even though this quinacridone red looks pinkish, I wanted a spring feel to my palette, so that feels like it's a good choice. And I'm going to add paint spray for shadows later. For the background, I'm going to use one of the 2 most famous watercolor techniques. It's called the wet in wet technique, which means the paper is wet before I apply the wet paint from the paintbrush. So it's wet in wet. And that's a good technique for colors to look soft without strong harsh lines. It also encourages colors to merge and mix together. And I managed to have this effect happening on gesso. Again, I tell you to expect it to look even more mesmerizing on great quality watercolor papers that are 100% cotton for sure. I'm loving I'm able to create pretty blooms by sprinkling clear water on the drying paints. This is a technique that's often used for beautiful effects. On gesso, I find that the paint dries quite quickly, like I was saying, kind of like the cellulose papers, the ones that are a little bit more affordable than 100% cotton ones. So it's a little bit of a challenge for me of letting go and letting those drying lines happen, but still I'm glad because we're having a very beautiful watercolor effect despite using normal paper, thanks to the primer. I feel that for a beginner with much less expectations about the paper than I have with my habits of using the best watercolor papers, this will be a delightful way to practice. Since I see that for me it's already fun, and I also remember when I started and I was into coloring books before I even started watercolor, and I was just sad that there were no watercolor coloring books out there. So that was the time I was talking about earlier when I had all my watercolor supplies sitting there and I was afraid to use them. Now I'm going to tackle the main subjects, and it's therapeutic to paint within shapes, I find. And there, you can choose to use the wet and wet technique depending on what you're painting. You can just experiment, or you can use the wet on dry technique, which is just to not wet the paper, it's dry, and you're just adding your wet paint from the brush. I like that it's possible to lift the color on gesso. It's pretty easy. I saw it on my small experiments that I did before the video, and it's actually almost easier than on regular watercolor paper. So you also have to be a little bit careful and not meddle for too long on the same spot. Same with some cellulose watercolor papers, no difference there. On my usual 100% cotton papers, the ones that I always use and recommend, you can lift, but you also have a lot of time to work on one area again and again in my experience, and when you're used to do the exercise. Notice how watercolor's transparency capabilities show there on the hair by adding yellow on top of the skin shadow color. Now I'm going to narrow the work down on each area and shape each element so it looks more realistic because I like that. And I think this paper, primed with gesso, is harder for realistic work because, like I said, you can't easily rework one area a lot without disturbing the previous layer. And that's also why my impression is that for beginners who just want to have fun and apply colors without spending a ton of time, this could be a perfect way to get started. Right now the painting looks a little bit boring to my taste, so I need to add some shadows. And I find it's funny how areas don't bleed into each other too easily on gesso. Usually they would, even if the paper was just a little bit wet, but not here. And probably because it dries so much faster. I haven't even been using my heat gun that much except for the background. And maybe you can tell I wasn't sure at first about what I was doing, but clearly I started finding a rhythm on how to use this primed paper, and the flowers are turning out to look so beautiful. I'm using what we call the dry brush technique on them right now, which is intended to create texture, and I find it's a really great technique on these flowers in particular because they're supposed to look white, but I still want some color to them. The face for me on such a surface is the most challenging, with everything drying faster than I'm used to because I like everything to be so smooth. But I'm seeing the watercolors spread out beautifully, and I can get subtle effects like the eyebrows spreading out just enough that they don't look like I added them in a cartoony way. And I'm really happy with the colors so far. I'll add this color theory book to my supplies link if you want to take a closer look at it. That's my first use of it, and so far I'm pretty happy with it. I want to enhance the shadows even more and realism too. And you don't have to take this many steps when you're starting out, but you can when you start to get better. And with a coloring book like this one, you have the shading done for you already, so it's easier to know where to add the shadows. And I didn't mention, but a specificity of these coloring books in particular is that each design comes in twice. So you can refer to the plain one anytime you need to in case you lose the shadows like I did. I don't really like to paint the exact same thing twice, but it could be reassuring to know that you have two opportunities with each design. I'm intensifying colors in some parts of the background to have the main subject stand out better in those places where it doesn't. When you make a background like I did with pretty bloom effects, I wouldn't recommend painting all over it again a second time, as those tiny but beautiful blooms will fade away and they won't show as well in the second layer. So for me, I'll leave most of my background intact. On the face, I want to start adding the little details that will make a great difference. I like to use random reference photos when I need ideas on the different tones of color I could include or little details I could add. On the face, the shadows really add to the character, and little things you can do for realism is to add some flyaway hair and a few freckles, for example. The highlights are my favorite part. They make a piece of art even more striking, and it's often the quickest part in the whole process. Lifting is so easy on gesso that I'm able to create nice highlights on the leaves. And look at how I'm able to brighten up the face a bit with a white pencil this time. The best part is adding some hair on the darkest areas of the background. They really pop this way. You can learn more about what to expect of watercolors and complete your first easy project from a real piece of watercolor paper with this YouTube video right here. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you in the next one.